Hi guys, welcome back to Nairobi Legal Insights. In today's video, we are going to be picking up on our discussion regarding contract law in Kenya, and our focus will be on the third element of a valid contract, which is intention. When it comes to intention, one thing we need to know as students of contract law is that in addition to offer and acceptance, an agreement must be characterized by intention. Meaning that if person A and person B are entering into an agreement, each one of them must actually intend to be bound by the consequences of that particular agreement. The other thing you need to note is that an agreement is actually going to be unenforceable unless both parties, meaning party A and party B, actually intended to be bound by the consequences of that specific agreement. As we continue discussing about the intention to create legal relations, just have this framework at the back of your mind so that you know where we started and where we are headed. Before we go into the details of what intention entails, I want us to first appreciate the types of agreements we have in Kenya. Now, the first type of an agreement we have is a domestic or social agreement, and these agreements that you could have between your parents, these agreements that could be between your father and your mother. Basically, the assumption here is that parties do not intend to be legally bound, and we're going to find out why by reviewing a few cases to see how the court actually handles such agreements. Now, this assumption can be rebutted, meaning that there are some domestic agreements that are actually binding, but generally domestic agreements do not bind the parties because there is never an intention for parties to be legally bound. And we're going to find out this as we review more cases to come. The next type of agreement is a business or a commercial agreement, and as you can already see, as far as these agreements are concerned, the assumption is that parties intend to be legally bound. However, this assumption can also be rebutted, meaning that there are exceptions whereby business or commercial agreements can actually not be binding on the parties. With that overview, we need to appreciate that even with commercial contracts, so long as there is no intention to be legally bound, then you cannot actually enforce that contract because the parties didn't intend to create legal relations between them. Now, there are certain things the court looks at, and as you can already see from your screen, the court will look at the nature or type of agreement, and we've discussed the types of agreements already. And the court is going to look at the circumstances in which the agreement was entered into. Now, all this is done to determine whether there was an intention to create legal relations. Now, generally, as far as domestic agreements are concerned, parties do not intend to be legally bound, and these agreements you make at home with your parents, these agreements between your parents. If your parents have promised to buy you a car after university, I want to assure you that there is no intention to create legal relations unless you actually have evidence to the contrary, meaning that if you can bring evidence that your parents actually wanted to create legal relations between you and them and that were to buy you a car after university, then that way a domestic agreement can be binding. So we're going to be looking at cases to see how these principles are applied and appreciate them much better. When it comes to domestic agreements, and when you're having a discussion on domestic agreements, you can refer to the case of BALFOUR versus BALFOUR, and I've provided an overview of the facts. But basically here, the husband had promised to pay his wife an allowance of 30 euros per month, which he later was not able to pay. And the wife, in a bid to actually enforce this promise of financial support, went ahead to sue the husband. Now, remember, this is a domestic agreement, and the court ruled against the wife by stating that her action was not sustainable as the parties did not intend to create a legal relationship. Remember that agreements between you and your parents, agreements between your parents themselves are not binding, unless there's evidence to the contrary. The reasoning behind this particular case is that the husband, who in this case is Mr. BALFOUR, his promise was not legally enforceable because there had not been intention to create legal relations. Remember, we've talked about the elements of a valid contract. We started by discussing about an offer, acceptance, and now intention. So we are now trying to understand, how does intention apply? To what extent will you be able to say that parties intended to create a legal relationship? And for domestic agreements, like I've stated earlier, this is a key case to read and understand and apply in your discussions all the time. As we stated earlier, as far as domestic agreements are concerned, there is no intention to be legally bound, but we have exceptions to this general rule. And this was seen in the case of merit versus merit. The facts of the case are presented on the screen, as you can see. Here, a couple jointly owned a house together, but Mr. Merit went ahead to live with another woman. Now, this couple sat down and agreed that Mr. Merit would pay Mrs. Merit 40 euros per month. And it was further agreed that eventually Mr. Merit would transfer the house which he jointly owned with Mrs. Merit to her. Now, when time reached, Mr. Merit attempted to go back on this agreement, and remember here the court ruled in favor of his wife. Now, even though this was a domestic agreement, there is clear intention that Mr. Merit intended to be bound by this specific agreement. And the ruling of the court was that even though there is that presumption in domestic agreements that they are not binding, this presumption can actually be rebutted, meaning that there can be a change in the rules. There can be an exception where there is evidence of an intention to create legal relations. Remember, by sitting down to write this contract and signing it, it clearly shows that there was an intention to transfer this house to Mrs. Merit and pay the 40 euros per month. And clearly, Mr. Merit could not go back on his promise. So this is an exception to what happens as far as intention is concerned in the domestic agreements. Before we move into commercial agreements, the takeaway point from domestic agreements is that the courts will proceed on the presumption that parties to these agreements do not intend to create legal relations. And remember, this is the general rule, but should there be evidence to prove otherwise, then in that case a domestic agreement will be binding because parties have intention to actually make it binding. When it comes to commercial agreements, one thing you need to know as a student of contract law is that there's a rebuttable presumption that parties to commercial agreements have the intention to be legally bound. However, we need to understand and remember that there are exceptions to this rule, meaning that we can also have commercial agreements where parties have no intention to be legally bound. And as you can see, should you sign a contract that contains a honorable pledge clause, in this case, this clause stipulates that the contract has no legal basis and cannot be enforced, meaning that you can have a commercial contract and once it entails this specific clause, it will have no legal enforcement, meaning that the party does not intend to be legally bound. The same applies to a letter of comfort. Now, the takeout point here is that as a student of contract law, remember that you need to read these two specific cases to appreciate commercial agreements. And as a student of business law, you need to just understand the principles that underlie domestic and commercial agreements and the exceptions that may apply to these specific agreements as well. Remember that you may be given a contract of like 40 pages, and if you don't read that contract to the end, it may contain a simple clause that will actually take away its legal enforcement before a court of law. As a law student, please remember that each discussion you bring out when answering a question, you need to back it up using either case law or specific sections of the appropriate acts that may apply to a specific question. And so consider reading through the cases I've provided on the previous slide. And in our next video, we are going to be looking at consideration, which is another element of a valid contract. Thank you.